My husband emptied our entire joint account to spend on another woman, and I got every single dollar of it back with one phone call made before he'd even finished celebrating. Not a lawsuit, not a screaming match, not months of court. One phone call, made calmly, from my own kitchen table, that quietly undid in about 15 minutes what my husband had spent weeks believing he'd gotten away with completely. Now, I know exactly what that sounds like. It sounds like a fantasy, or a trick, or some impossible legal loophole that only works in stories. It isn't. It's something almost anyone in my situation could have done if they understood one simple thing about how that money actually worked, one thing my husband Derek was absolutely certain I didn't understand. He spent our entire marriage quietly assuming I didn't know how our finances worked, and never once checking whether that assumption was true. That assumption is the entire reason this story has a happy ending. For me, anyway. This is the story of the day Derek drained our joint account for his girlfriend and the single phone call that brought it all back, while he was still congratulating himself on getting away with it. Let me tell you exactly how it happened, slowly, because I promise you. The misdirection in this story runs the exact opposite direction from the one you're expecting. But before I do, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments. Has someone ever taken something from you and been so smug, so sure they'd won that the look on their face when it came back was almost worth the theft itself? What happened? Be honest. Because the best part of this whole story isn't the money. It's the 15 minutes, really. The day or two that Derek spent believing he'd won. Tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one. And before I get to the phone call, I want to say one thing to anyone watching who is in the early, sick, free-falling moments of a discovery like this, the ones where you've just seen the empty account, or the message, or the proof, and your whole body wants to do something, anything, right now. Please hear me. The very first thing to do is nothing. Not nothing forever. Nothing for 10 minutes. Sit down. Breathe. Do not call the person. Do not send the furious message. Because the quality of what you do in the first hour will shape everything that comes after, and the first hour is exactly when you're least equipped to act wisely, because the pain is screaming. The single most powerful move available to you, almost always, is to get calm before you get active, to let the first wave of rage pass through you without acting on it, so that when you do act, you act from clarity instead of from the wound. My entire recovery turned on the fact that I gave myself those 10 minutes. Give yourself the 10 minutes. They might be the most valuable 10 minutes of your life. Let me set the scene, because the setup is everything. Derek and I had a joint account, the main one. The one our paychecks went into. The one that held the bulk of our shared savings. And for most of our marriage, Derek had been the one who managed it, in the sense that he liked to feel in control of it, liked to talk about it as though it were his domain, his money, his responsibility. I let him have that feeling, because it seemed to matter to him, and because I had long ago learned that the things Derek needed to feel in charge of were not always worth the fight. But here is the part Derek forgot, the part that becomes the whole hinge of this story. A joint account is not one person's. It is, by its very nature, equally and fully both people's. Every dollar in it belonged just as much to me as to him. He had spent so many years acting like the manager of our money that he had genuinely come to believe he was the owner of it. He was not. We both were. And that distinction was about to become the most expensive lesson of his life. I want to dwell on that distinction for a moment, because it is the quiet, unglamorous fact at the center of this entire story, and almost everyone misunderstands it the same way Derek did. When a couple has a joint account, the law in most places does not see it as belonging mostly to whoever earns more, or whoever manages it, or whoever opened it. It sees both names on the account as equal owners of all of it. That's what joint means. It is not his money that you have access to, or your money that he helps with. It is fully and equally both of yours, every dollar. And that means each owner has the standing to act to question transactions, to dispute activity, to assert their rights not as a favor granted by the other person, but as a basic right of ownership. Derek had spent years performing the role of the man in charge of the money, and somewhere along the way the performance became, in his own head, the reality. He forgot that the entire time, sitting right next to his name on that account, was mine carrying exactly the same weight, exactly the same rights, exactly the same power. He didn't lose the money because of some clever trick I pulled. He lost it because he'd forgotten a fact that had been true since the day we opened the account. Then came the day. I logged in one ordinary morning to pay a routine bill, and the joint account, the one that should have held our savings, the cushion under our entire life, was nearly empty. Drained. In a matter of days, almost everything was simply gone, transferred out in a series of large withdrawals I had never seen, never approved, and never authorized. I sat there and refreshed the page, the way you do, as if the money might reappear if I just looked again. It did not. It did not take me long to understand where it had gone. Her name was Brooke. The money had been flowing, for some time, into the lifestyle of a woman my husband had been seeing behind my back. The dinners. The gifts. The weekends away. And then, the final insult. The move that actually drained the account down to nothing. A large sum he'd pulled out to fund something for her, some grand gesture, some down payment on their bright shared future with our money. The money I had helped save, dollar by careful dollar, for years. He had taken our shared savings, half of which was unquestionably mine, and he had handed it to his girlfriend. There is a specific cruelty to that kind of theft that I think deserves to be named, because it's worse than the simple loss of money. When Derek drained that account, he wasn't just being unfaithful. And he wasn't just being a thief. He was reaching into the safety I had spent years helping to build, the cushion that was there for emergencies, for our future, for the rainy days every careful person plans for, and he was spending my security on his pleasure. That money represented every careful choice I'd ever made. Every time I'd said no to something I wanted so we could save. Every quiet act of responsibility that builds a stable life. And he took all of it and used it to impress another woman. It wasn't only that he loved someone else, it was that he was willing to dismantle the foundation under my feet to do it, and he assumed I'd be too helpless to stop him. The money was a wound, but the assumption underneath it that I would simply sit in the rubble of my own savings and accept it was the real insult. And it was also, as it turned out, his fatal mistake. If your stomach just dropped imagining logging in and finding your life's savings gone, handed to the person your spouse was cheating with, do me one quick favor before I tell you about the phone call. Tap like and subscribe to the channel. I'm not asking for nothing. These calm revenge stories get buried by the algorithm unless people actually engage. And your one tap is the only reason the next one reaches a woman who is, tonight, staring at an account balance that doesn't make sense. And believe me, the phone call is the part you came for. Now, here is where the misdirection in this story runs backwards from what you'd expect. Because the whole time you've been listening, you've probably been assuming I was the one being set up, the unsuspecting wife, blindsided, robbed, about to have to claw her way through a long and painful fight to get anything back. That's certainly what Derek assumed. He had drained the account so confidently, so completely, precisely because he was sure I had no idea how to stop him, no understanding of our finances, no move to make. He thought he had successfully misdirected me for years into financial helplessness, into being a woman who'd be lost without him. But the real misdirection had been running the other way the entire time. Because while Derek was busy believing I didn't understand our money, I understood it perfectly. I just never made him feel threatened by that. Because there had never been a reason to. Until now. This is the heart of the reverse misdirection, and I want to make sure you really see it, because it runs against everything these stories usually train us to expect. We're used to the version where the husband secretly understands the money and the wife is kept in the dark. My marriage was the opposite, and neither of us ever said so out loud. Derek loved feeling like the one in command of our finances, and I let him have that feeling not because I didn't understand the money, but because I understood something more important, that there was no cost to letting him feel in charge while everything was fine, and that a quiet competence is far more useful than a loud one. So for years, he performed ownership, and I practiced understanding. He talked about the accounts, I actually knew them. He felt powerful, I was prepared. And the whole time, he mistook my graciousness for ignorance, my lack of need to prove myself for a lack of ability. That misreading cost him everything. Because when the moment finally came, he was a man who'd been performing competence, up against a woman who'd been quietly possessing it. There is no contest between those two things. The performance loses every time the stakes get real. So I did not panic. I did not call Derek and scream. I did not drive to wherever he was. I sat down at my own kitchen table with my own coffee, and I let my heartbeat slow down, and I thought clearly about what would actually help me, and then I made one phone call. Not to Derek, to the bank. Now here comes my favorite part of the whole story. Because Derek did not know any of this had happened. Wait, let me back up and explain what the call actually did first, because the order matters. Here is what Derek did not understand about the very account he'd just drained, the simple, powerful fact that made one phone call enough. It was a joint account. And on a joint account, both account holders have rights. Both of them equally, including the right to question, to flag, and to dispute unauthorized activity on the account. Derek had moved a very large sum of marital money out of a shared account for purposes that had nothing to do with our marriage and everything to do with another woman. Without my knowledge or authorization, and as an equal owner of that account, I had every right to pick up the phone and say so. I will not pretend that a single call magically reverses every situation, because every bank and every circumstance is different, and I want to be honest with you about that. But here is what was true in mine. I was an equal, legal owner of that account. The transfers had been made without my authorization. And the moment I calmly, clearly, and without a trace of panic explained that to the right person at the bank, that I was a joint owner disputing a series of large, unauthorized transfers of marital funds, wheels began to turn that Derek had never imagined could turn. Because Derek had been thinking like a man who owned the money. The bank dealt with me as exactly what I was, and had always been. The other person who owned that money just as fully as he did. And here is the detail that made it land so beautifully, the thing Derek had been too arrogant to consider. The large transfer he'd made, the grand gesture, the big one had not yet fully, irreversibly cleared in the way he assumed. There was a window. There is, with many large transfers, a window, and I had made my call inside it. Because I had not wasted a single hour panicking or confronting or screaming. I had not wasted even 10 minutes. I had moved, calmly and immediately, the moment I understood what had happened, while Derek was still off somewhere feeling victorious and unbothered. Speed, it turned out, was everything, and rage is the slowest thing there is. The difference between losing that money and recovering it was, quite literally, the difference between reacting with rage and reacting with a clear head. Rage would have had me on the phone to Derek. Clarity had me on the phone to the bank. I want to underline that contrast, Because it is the single most practical lesson in this entire story, and it applies to almost any crisis you will ever face. When something terrible happens, a betrayal, a theft, a sudden shock, there is a fork in the road, and it appears in the very first minute. One path is reaction. The phone call to the person who hurt you, the confrontation, the demand for an explanation, the need to express the enormous feeling immediately. The other path is response, the cold, clear question of what action, taken right now, will actually protect you. They feel almost identical in the moment, because both involve picking up the phone. But they lead to completely opposite places. If I had called Derek, I'd have gotten the satisfaction of his guilt and lost the money forever. Because the call would have alerted him and the window would have closed. By calling the bank instead, I gave up the satisfaction and kept the savings. The discipline is in noticing the fork and choosing the boring, effective path over the loud, satisfying one. Almost everyone, in the heat of betrayal, calls the person. The ones who recover call the institution. The feeling is the same in your chest. The outcome could not be more different. So while Derek was somewhere out there celebrating his clever escape, toasting his bright new future, I was quietly, calmly, lawfully exercising my rights as the equal owner of our account that I had always been disputing the unauthorized transfers, flagging the activity, putting the wheels in motion to bring our marital money back where it belonged. And it worked. Not by magic, and not by any trick, but by the simple, devastating power of a person who knew her rights and acted on them faster than the person who'd spent years underestimating her ever imagined she could. Now here comes my favorite part of the whole story, because Derek did not know any of this had happened. For a full day, maybe two, he walked around believing he had successfully drained our account, funded his new life, and gotten away clean. He was, in his mind, a man who had won. And I let him have it. I made the conscious choice to let him keep his little victory, his smug certainty, his pleasant evening. For as long as it lasted, because I knew something he didn't. And there is no satisfaction quite like the calm of a person who knows the floor is about to disappear from under someone who thinks they're standing on solid ground. I'll be honest about those quiet hours of letting him keep his false victory, because there was something almost surreal about them. Derek came home that evening pleased with himself in a way he probably thought he was hiding, a little lighter, a little more generous. The satisfied air of a man who believes he's outmaneuvered everyone. He made small talk. He may even have been kind to me, in the loose, easy way of someone who's gotten what he wanted and can afford to be pleasant. And I sat across from him and matched his small talk, and felt, underneath my own calm, the strangest mix of grief and power. Grief, because watching him be cheerful while believing he'd successfully robbed me was its own confirmation of exactly who he'd become. And power, because I alone knew that the ground he was standing on so confidently had already been pulled out from under him, and was simply waiting for gravity to do the rest. I have rarely felt so completely composed and so completely heartbroken at the same time. Both feelings were correct. And then, in its own time, the floor disappeared. Derek discovered, in the way these things get discovered, that the money was not where he'd so confidently put it, that the grand gesture had quietly unwound, that his girlfriend's exciting new future had developed a sudden, severe, and terminal funding problem. And he came to me, finally, the smugness entirely gone now, pale and rattled, demanding to know what had happened to the money. And I told him the truth, calmly, the way you explain something simple to someone who should have known it all along. I said, Derek, it was a joint account. That means it was half mine. You moved a large amount of our shared money without my authorization, to spend on another woman. So I called the bank, as the equal owner I've always been, and I disputed it. You didn't get away with anything. You just got a head start on finding out that you never understood our money or me as well as you thought you did." He had no answer, because there was no answer. He stood in our kitchen, opening and closing his mouth, reaching for the indignation of a man who'd been wronged, and finding none available to him. Because you cannot be robbed of something that was always half someone else's. He had built his entire confidence on the belief that the money was his to move, and that I was too financially clueless to stop him. Both halves of that belief turned out to be wrong, and the cost of being wrong was every dollar he'd tried to give away. And I noticed something, watching him grapple with it, that I think is true of almost everyone who builds their power on someone else's assumed helplessness. The helplessness was never real. It was only assumed, and the moment it evaporated, he had nothing left. Derek's entire sense of control in our marriage had been built on the belief that I couldn't function without him handling things that I didn't understand the money, couldn't manage the accounts, would be lost and helpless if he ever decided to leave. He'd told himself that story for so long that he'd come to rely on it as a fact. And when one phone call proved it false, it didn't just cost him the money. It collapsed the whole foundation of how he'd understood our marriage and his place in it. He'd thought he was the strong one carrying a dependent. He discovered he'd been underestimating an equal the entire time. Men like Derek are never as powerful as they think. Because their power was always borrowed against your assumed weakness, and the day you prove you were never weak, the loan comes due all at once. From there on, the divorce was clean and strongly in my favor. Because a man who has just been caught draining a joint account to fund an affair is not in a position of strength. And because everything I had done was completely lawful the calm. Rightful action of an equal owner protecting marital assets. The money was back where it belonged, in the account that was as much mine as his. The affair, now fully in the open and documented, did Derek no favors in anything that followed. And the fact that he'd tried to dissipate marital assets to fund it did him fewer favors still. Brooke, I understand, was considerably less enchanted with Derek once the grand gesture he'd made with someone else's savings evaporated and the funding for their bright future simply vanished. There is not much romance in a man whose big romantic move turns out to have been made with money that was never fully his to give. I think about Brooke sometimes with less anger than you might expect. Because she too had been sold a fantasy by a man who turned out to be standing on borrowed ground. He'd presented himself to her, I'm sure, as a man of means, a man making grand romantic gestures, a man building her a future. And then, overnight, the gestures evaporated and the future lost its funding, and she got to discover the same thing I did. Just from a different angle, that Derek's confidence had always been bigger than his actual standing. He hadn't given her a future. He'd given her a brief, exciting illusion paid for with his wife's savings, and when the savings came home, the illusion went with them. I don't know what became of them after that, and I find I don't much care. A relationship that begins by spending another woman's security rarely has a strong foundation, and one that loses its funding the moment that woman picks up a phone has, I suspect, very little left to stand on at all. And if you'll let me leave you with one thing, not just as someone who got revenge, but as a woman who got every dollar back with a single phone call, it's this. Understand your own money. Not someday, not when there's a problem now, while everything is calm. Know what accounts you have. Know your rights as an owner of them. Know how the money actually moves and what you are entitled to do about it. Because the people who get hurt worst in these situations are almost never the ones who lacked the rights. They're the ones who had the rights all along and didn't know it, who'd been quietly convinced by someone else that the money was beyond their understanding. Derek's entire plan depended on me being that woman. The reason it failed is that I wasn't. And I want to make this lesson as concrete and as useful as I possibly can, because I would rather this video prevent a theft than just describe one. So here is what I gently ask you to do this week, whatever your situation. Whether or not you have any reason to worry, sit down once, calmly, and actually learn your own financial life. Know what accounts exist with your name on them and what kind of accounts they are. Know whether they're joint or individual, because the rights are different. Know how to log in to each one yourself, with your own credentials, not your partner's. Know, in broad strokes, what's normal in them, so you'd notice if something wasn't. None of this is an act of suspicion. None of it means you distrust the person you love. It is simply the basic adult ownership of your own life, the same way you'd know where your own passport is. Most people who get financially blindsided are not unintelligent, and they are not careless about everything. They simply outsourced one crucial area of their life so completely that they became a stranger to it. Don't be a stranger to your own money. It is yours. Act like it while everything is calm, so that you'll be ready if it ever isn't. Knowledge of your own finances is not a luxury, and it is not a betrayal of trust. It is the difference between being robbed and making one phone call. The people who truly love you will never need you to stay ignorant of your own money. The ones who quietly prefer you helpless have already told you exactly why. I keep coming back, even now, to those 15 minutes, the length of one phone call, and how completely they reshaped my life. Derek had spent days, maybe weeks, plotting his grand exit, moving the money, building the fantasy, savoring his own cleverness. And all of it came undone in the length of time it takes to make a cup of coffee. Because I knew one true thing and acted on it without panic. That's the part I want you to carry away more than any detail of bank policy, which varies everywhere and which you should always check for your own situation. The thing that saved me was not a loophole. It was preparedness meeting composure. I knew my rights before I needed them, and when the moment came, I stayed calm enough to use them. Knowledge without calm panics. Calm without knowledge freezes. But knowledge and calm together, in one clear-headed woman at a kitchen table, turned out to be more powerful than every scheme my husband could devise. You don't need to be lucky. You don't need to be ruthless. You just need to know what's yours, and be steady enough to claim it. There's one more thing, though. After the dust settled and I had our money safely back, I went really looking, for the first time at the full history of that joint account. And in it, I found a pattern of smaller withdrawals, going back far longer than the affair with Brooke, that revealed Derek had been quietly siphoning our shared money for years, for something I had never suspected and could never have guessed. What I found, and what I did once I understood how long it had really been going on, is a story entirely its own. And it might just be the most satisfying one yet. It's right there on your screen. You are going to want to see how that one ends.